Well, hello there. My name is Christopher Scott. Thanks for joining me for these series of videos that I'm doing, giving the 5 interpretations of the creation account in Genesis 1. So in this video, I'm going to provide to you and give you a summary of the young earth creationist view of interpreting Genesis 1. So in these videos, if you haven't watched any of the other ones, I will summarize the view. I'll give you the strengths of that view, the weaknesses, the other names that the view goes by. I'll reference some popular supporters and some additional works that you can read if you are interested to learn more about each of these views. In the description down below, I'll give you a link to my website where you can read a lot of these notes that I have actually written out word for word in case you wanted to utilize that for a Sunday school class or teaching another form or anything like that, or even for your own study. So, the young earth creationist view. Let me give you the summary of this view. Young earth creationism believes the earth was created in 6 literal 24-hour days with the appearance of age. In other words, God created the universe and our world about 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, right? The earth is young and the universe is young. That's why it goes by the young earth creationist view. Now, I say 6,000 to 10,000 because some people would say there are no gaps in the genealogies of Genesis 5 and Genesis 10 and 11, so they would go with the 6,000 years old. Some young earth creationists would say there are some gaps in Genesis 5 and Genesis 10 and 11, therefore the earth might be 10,000 years old. That's why there's the difference in the ages there. Now, most young earth creationists believe God created a quote-unquote mature earth, meaning the earth was created and appears to be older than it is, right? That the earth is young, but it might look old according to certain scientific methods of understanding it. The young earth creationists would also say that the earth was created good and perfect, therefore there was harmony and not survival of the fittest before Genesis 3. That the earth was, changed drastically after the fall, therefore the earth is young. Now, the strengths of this view are many. The first strength is the Hebrew word for day used in Genesis 1, the Hebrew word yom, day. That is a word that is used a lot in the Old Testament, but whenever yom is used with cardinal numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, or ordinal numbers, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, whenever yom is used with cardinal numbers or ordinal numbers, it refers to 24-hour periods of time. The word day, yom, does get used for longer periods of time, such as, the day of the Lord describes a period of time in which God supernaturally acts, right? That's not a literal 24-hour period. But whenever that word is used with cardinal numbers and ordinal numbers in the Old Testament, it refers to a 24-hour period of time. So that is a strong strength, is following the lexical use of yom, and the syntax of the text supports a young earth interpretation. Another strength of the young earth creationism view is the phrases evening and morning used on each day of creation doesn't really make sense if the days aren't literally 24 hours. A third point of support and strength for the young earth view is Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11, teaches Israel to work 6 days and rest on the 7th day. And the pattern that they're supposed to follow is God's work for 6 days creating and then resting on a 7th day. Another period or point of strength is that there was no death before the fall of Genesis 3. Therefore, time and creation operated very differently during those times. Another point of support is that there are various statements by Jesus, the apostles, and Isaiah that indicated Adam and Eve were created at the beginning of creation, right? That there was a creation of the heavens and the earth, and there was creation of things swimming in waters and flying things in the sky and animals on the ground, and Adam and Eve were created at a close period of time of all of those other things, right? You can read Psalm 19:1, Psalm 97:6, Job 12:7 through 10, Mark 10:6, Mark 13:19, Luke 11:50 to 51, and Romans 1:20. These are all phrases and verses that seem to indicate Adam and Eve were created at the beginning of creation at a close period of time with all of the other things God created. They weren't created 40 million years after birds were created. Another point of support is historical theology. Historical theology supports this interpretation. For 1800 years in the history of the Christian church, most people, pretty much all of Christians, believed the earth was young. And we had 1400 years of Jewish interpretation supporting that view. Another point of support is that if we believe in God performing miracles and that God can act supernaturally, then creating everything we see in 7 days is certainly within God's potential, right? If God can raise Jesus from the dead, if Jesus could miraculously heal the blind and the paralyzed, I'm sure he could create the earth and everything we see in just a couple of days. Another point of support is that when the Bible describes the creation of the earth by God throughout Scripture, it's always as a past action that happened. We don't ever really read about God describing the process in which it took place. It's always as a past action that occurred and seems to have occurred quickly. I mentioned this earlier, but it's good to mention again as a strength. The Hebrew syntax of Genesis 1 supports a plain, literal interpretation of the 6 days of creation over 24-hour periods. Meaning, Hebrew poetry has a certain way that it is presented, where if you read the Psalms and the book of Job, which are primarily poetry, it is structured very different than the book of 1 Samuel or the book of Judges or the book of Joshua. Meaning Hebrew poetry is very, very complex in its syntax and its structure and its verb forms, versus narrative in Scripture is very, very simple. It is usually it's usually verb, subject, object. Verb, subject, object. That's Hebrew narrative. Hebrew poetry is not that way, but in Genesis 1 and 2, we have the narrative form of Hebrew syntax. It's very, very simple. In fact, the first poetry verse in Scripture doesn't come until Genesis 1:27, where we see a little bit of parallelism describing how God made man in his image. In his image, he made man. That little bit of parallelism is the first poetry we see in Genesis. So the syntax supports a basic, plain, literal reading of Genesis 1 as narrative, not something poetic, not something, that says this but really means something different. It's a plain, basic reading. Seems to be the way Moses intended it to read. Another point of strength is that if Moses wanted to indicate that creation took place over millions or billions of years, there are other Hebrew words that Moses could have used in addition to day. He could have said weeks, he could have said months, he could have said seasons, he could have said years. There are many other Hebrew words he could have used to describe a long period of time. But instead he used the words day, the word day. And lastly, another point of support is that God uses words of time to describe time in ways that we can understand it. Sometimes I hear people quote Psalm 94 and 2 Peter 3:8 that reference, a 1,000 years is like a day to the Lord, and, that time doesn't mean to us what it means to God. Well, that's true. Time doesn't mean to God what it means to us. But Scripture is given to us to communicate God's truth to us. So when it talks about time, and when authors use time words to communicate to us reading it, they are trying to describe to us time in a way that we could understand it. Just because time is different to God doesn't mean the time in Genesis is different to us, is what I'm trying to say. So you probably have figured out that I hold the young earth creationism view. I've got a lot of strengths. Now let me give you a weakness of this view. And you already know this. Young earth creationism does not match what most agnostic and atheistic scientists believe. According to physical sciences, according to life sciences, according to experimental sciences, or even according to some historical scientists. There's different categories of science, and the young earth creationist view does not match what most of those atheistic or agnostic scientists teach. Now, I qualify that scientist as an atheistic or agnostic scientist because there are a lot of really good Christian scientists that do hold to a young earth creationist view, and I'll mention those a little later. Now, other names for this young earth creationism view, some people call it the immediate creation view. Some people call it recent creation. Okay. Now, let me give you some further reading. I'm adapting this from my arguments from Ken Ham's chapter in the book, 4 Views on Creation, Evolution, and Intelligent Designs. I'm using some of Ken Ham's material there. Some other great resources you might want to pick up to read more about this young earth creationist view would be Henry Morris and John Whitcomb, their book, The Genesis Flood. Or you can read Henry Morris, Biblical Creationism is the name of that book. You can read A.C. Custance, Without Form and Void. You can read Henry Morris and John Morris, their book, Science, Scripture, and the Young Earth. You can read John Whitcomb Jr., The Early Earth. John Whitcomb Jr., The World That Perished is another book. And Ken Ham has a bunch of resources. His most popular is probably The Answers book. Now, some popular supporters of the young earth creationist view, some people you might hear on the radio or see their books sold in bookstores would be David Jeremiah, John MacArthur, J. Vernon McGee, John Calvin, and Martin Luther were all young earth creationists. So I hope that gives you a feel for this view, a summary of this view, and also gives you some strengths and the weaknesses of this view. Thanks for watching. Hope to catch you again on another video.